Marvellous, lovely. Hi everyone, good to see so many people here today. Matt has kindly asked me to talk for around about an hour about menopause at work, and that's because I run an outsourced HR service providing company. I think possibly I've got some value to add to this particular subject as we support our clients and therefore their employees through menopause and other bits and pieces. So hopefully you've got not just your cup of coffee, but maybe a pen and some paper to hand, because I'm hoping to be able to give you some useful information, some tools that you can take away and do something with on your return to your day job. So I hope it's all right, Matt, if I just introduce our team very quickly. We're only a small team. We offer quite a personal, tailored service to make sure we get under the skin of whichever clients that we are working with. So here we go. So menopause. The key areas that we're going to look at today are here on the slides. And that's because menopause is a really big thing for employers. Menopausal women are one of the fastest growing demographics in the workplace, and that's data taken from the CIPD. But actually, despite the fact that there's a large number of people this affects, many people struggle to manage those changes that their bodies are going through. So around about a quarter of menopausal women experience debilitating symptoms, and a lot of those will exit the workplace completely at that point in their careers. And at that point in their careers, they're likely to be at the top of their game. So for an employer's perspective, this is a massive loss of talent and something that employers can manage better, I think, as menopause begins to lose its taboo. Really, it's about employer awareness and supporting those employees so they can retain them, particularly at an important time at the moment when unemployment, it's difficult, isn't it? The hiring market is really challenging. So we don't want to lose the great people that we have because we might not be able to fill those roles once they're vacant. So just a little bit of a caveat around all of this. I'm not a doctor. I'm pulling here, when I talk to you, I'm pulling on a variety of different research sources and best practice, and I'll try and tell you what those sources are as we go through. I am not making it up, but I am not a doctor. All right. So let's start off then with talking about what menopause actually is. So clinically, menopause is a point in time 12 months after a woman's last period. So the hormone changes at, and in fact before that point in time, can cause such a range of physical and psychological side effects to a woman, some of which can last for a number of years. So the years leading up to periods stopping completely, when women may have changes in their cycles and hot flushes and other symptoms, those are called perimenopause. And that's what we've got here on the slide in front of you. Perimenopause is that transition period. And perimenopause itself most often begins maybe age 45 up to the age of 55 as estrogen levels are in decline. So the average age for a woman to reach the menopause in the UK is 51. On average, most of the symptoms that we're seeing here in front of us last around 4 years from when a woman's periods end. However, and this is quite important to underline, 10% of women experience them for 12 years. And that's all taken from the NHS menopause symptoms page, that data. But it's not just those people. It's not just people around the age of 45 to 55. About 1% of women experience the menopause before the age of 40. And this is premature menopause or premature ovarian insufficiency. I'm going to try not to blind you too much with technical medical terms. So I've used the word women quite a lot, but it's worth me noting that other groups are affected too. So as an example, some trans, some non-binary employees will go through the menopause, sometimes due to changes in their hormones, for example. And some younger women will also go through the menopause, for example, if they've undergone cancer or surgery, or even if they're taking medication to prevent breast cancer, where higher than average chance of diagnosis of cancer is there due to their family history. So that medication can bring on the menopause as well. So this is actually something that affects quite a large proportion of people, but it's actually not been very well talked about, even amongst women and even in families, until the last few years. And Davina McCall, of course, has been one of those people that's been openly talking about menopause and her menopause and how it's affecting her. So I guess it's also important to say that this is normal and that there are treatments and support for those who are quite literally suffering. So the symptoms here that are in front of you on the slide, the ones with a percentage sign next to them are from a study from Lancaster University. All the other ones are from the NHS list, okay? That's a massive number of symptoms that menopausal people might be experiencing. And I thought it might be just worth me, I don't know if this is probably too small for you to read, but these basically are some heartbreaking stories lifted from a menopause support group. Of course they're anonymised, of course they are. And this is just a small sample, bringing to life, I suppose, for you, the real life implications here. So things like performance problems stemming from confidence and a feeling of overwhelm, people being housebound due to flooding several days a month, joint pain bad enough to bring on tears, heartburn, bloating, keeping people awake at night, embarrassment from sweat during a hot flush so bad it was like a river, and even surgery to help with the flooding, which flooded out an IUD intended to deliver hormones to sort of minimise symptoms. So I suppose my point here is genuine suffering around something which is very rarely talked about until recently. So the underlying point here really actually is it's not appropriate to deem any of these symptoms minor or to presume that once the hormone fluctuations settle down, they'll improve. This process of menopause can take many years, maybe 10 years or more. That's such a huge proportion of anybody's life. And if the individual's quality of life and their family life and work life are going to be affected, they absolutely can, and they can deteriorate sometimes irreparably. And I mean, the end result for some people, and figures published by the Samaritans, showed that the highest rate of suicide among women was between the ages of 45 and 54. And I think that there's a direct correlation there as far as I'm concerned. So what else can we say? Going to GPs, you might not always get the support that you need. I think it's still the case there's no mandatory training for GPs on the menopause. So time and time again, we're hearing cases of people that are being misdiagnosed, and therefore the treatment they're receiving, maybe it's medication, maybe it's something else, isn't actually having the effect that it's needed to rectify some of these symptoms. So this is quite a miserable time, I think, for a lot of people. All right. So estrogen, it's all about dropping estrogen levels, and that drop in estrogen starts to drop significantly actually from about the age of 40. And it can affect all of the areas that you see on the slide today. Who knew, right? Who knew? So what we do know is that 80% of people going through the menopause have symptoms, 25% of those are severe symptoms, half of women don't see their GP, and 42% say that symptoms are worse than they expected. So this will come as a surprise to a lot of people, the way they are personally affected by this. What else can we say? This is from the Primary Care Women's Health Forum impact study, by the way. 99% of symptoms and negatively impact on work, 1/3 significantly. Again, as an employer, this is massive. And what we see is that, and I'm going to stop quoting statistics in just a moment, I promise, 59% of people going through the menopause had taken time off work through symptoms. So there's your attendance dropping. 18% were off for more than 8 weeks. 21% of those women didn't go for a promotion. There's your succession and your talent pool. 19% reduced their hours. So again, they are less present and will be able to be less productive in 20% less hours. And 12% resigned or took early retirement. Huge implications for employers here. And why? Well, it boiled down to the fact that 45% of those people felt that they weren't as effective, as efficient. 26% said they were delivering a poor quality of work, and 7% talked about poor concentration. So as an employer, this is massive, okay? I don't think I'll quote any more stats. I've got a whole raft of stats behind your heads, but I think I've blinded you with the research. I think I've made my case that this is not to be taken lightly. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a look at risk and from an employer's perspective. So you've got a couple of pieces of legislation on the slide in front of you. So for employers, we've already heard, haven't we, that this brings on a perceived or an actual dip on performance and a loss of key personnel at key peaks of often in the peak of their career. So what we need to do is make sure that we're aware of the menopause and its symptoms and how they can affect our team. And being aware of this is going to help the staff to do their job confidently, I hope, and effectively. As an employee, you've got a duty to make sure the health, safety and welfare of your employees is maintained, and to undertake risk assessments to assess any risks that that workplace may pose. Now we know, don't we, that different risks and different hazards will apply to different people. So it's directly relevant here because the health and certainly mental well-being of menopausal women needs to be looked at to make sure we mitigate any risks that might arise. And then we've got the Equalities Act. So this comes from the perspective of discrimination. Okay. Now, although people going through the menopause aren't automatically protected by the Equalities Act, it is not a disability, for example. It is not a specific protected characteristic like race or age. There are times when menopause may be classed as a disability if it meets the required definition. And that, does anybody know the definition of a disability underneath the Equalities Act? Let's ask that question. Who's brave enough to have a stab? Hopefully somebody's managing the chat for us.
Carl, has anyone put any responses in there, or do you want to come off mute and answer the question, anybody?
Currently, there isn't anybody that I see in the chat or the FAQ that's answered, so.
Is nobody brave enough? Shall I spiel it out for people? So, in order for anybody to be classed as having a disability, they need to be experiencing significant and long-lasting conditions that affect their day-to-day life. And by long-lasting, that means has lasted or is likely to last more than 12 months. So you can see how somebody suffering with those debilitating menopausal symptoms can actually fall within that definition if the symptoms are having a significant effect on their day-to-day life, like being housebound, for example, like joint pain resulting in you not being able to climb the stairs, for example. It's that kind of thing that we're looking at. So menopause can well be classed as a disability, but won't automatically be because it really depends on the symptom. Okay. So what else under the Equalities Act? Well, gender reassignment, for example, is a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act, and a person that has that protected characteristic of gender reassignment, if they're planning to go through or are going through or have gone through the process to reassign their sex, because there'll be hormone treatment happening. And this treatment could be changing physical or other attributes related to someone's sex, and those hormones may well put somebody within that bracket. And what else? The Equalities Act can lead to, for the menopause, potentially sex discrimination claims, because if there is unwanted behaviour, harassment, about someone's menopause symptoms, that absolutely is covered. So those funny jokes, oh, another hot flush kind of thing, not really so funny for the receiver sometimes, and it could be construed as harassment. So we've just got to be careful there as well. And again, age discrimination. So you're not automatically an older or a younger person when you go through the menopause. but indirectly your age is there. So if there's less favourable treatment because they're going through the menopause, and that is because somebody is a bit older, potentially there is an indirect link there. But it's not, menopause is not automatically covered. So we need to be mindful, is the long and the short of it. So, my apologies, that shouldn't have pinged up. So what else? What are the implications then? Got some implications that we've already mentioned on the screen in front of us. And so as a result, we need to make sure that we're defending ourselves, arming ourselves, preparing ourselves, protecting ourselves against any liabilities, any costly compensation awards. So even with that aside, we should be taking all steps to offer support and assistance to individuals who are going through the menopause. And if we do, we will experience real benefits of increased attendance, better performance, less employee turnover, and reduced risk as well. So really, I suppose the key message I'm trying to push through today is that it's all about fostering a workplace where employees feel safe, which will lead to organisations being more likely to retain the skills and experience of employees. And actually, that doesn't just apply to those experiencing the menopause, but other people too. Menopause is only one thing that people deal with. And while it's really easy to trivialise some of the symptoms, it's just another hot flush, we really do need to understand that this can be challenging and uncomfortable and even traumatic for the employees that are experiencing it. And as an employer, really it is your duty to make sure that they continue to feel safe and that they've got a sense of well-being. Okay. I think it might be worth saying here that one of our clients suffered a bereavement when someone committed suicide whilst going through the menopause. They had been misdiagnosed, the treatment was incorrect, and that is, the underlying, I suppose that's the worst case scenario, but it is happening. It is happening out there right now. All right, so what can we do then? We know there's risk. We know we want our team to feel we care for their well-being, their safety. What can we do? Well, we've got a few things here. So before I go through in detail, actually, let me just say there has been a significant rise in the number of tribunals that involve the treatment of workers going through menopause. And menopause is increasingly referred to alongside other issues in cases where claimants are seeking to contest dismissal as unfair. And again, this is falling under the disability and sex discrimination piece. So, first things first, here are some things that you can practically do in your workplace. Let's have a think about whether our existing policies and procedures cater for the psychosocial needs of menopause-related issues. So, for example, whether you can introduce flexible working patterns if you haven't before. That's one example. Okay. The second example we've got here is risk assessments. Let's make sure that we do risk assessments and that those risk assessments can consider specific risks to menopausal women and identify reasonable adjustments for those individuals. So reasonable adjustments are a requirement where the menopause does fall within the definition of being a disability. But why wouldn't you make reasonable adjustments even if it doesn't? And the reasonable adjustments, we will go into more detail in a moment. The things I'm thinking about might be as simple as maybe there's a risk of poor ventilation, okay? Can you put the person closer to an open window? Simple things like that. Maybe there's not great access to toilets and washing facilities. Maybe you could look at that. Other risks like they can't control temperature or light. Maybe the uniforms are made of some horrible polyester which cause people to sweat more. Actually, most significant risks probably are a lack of awareness of the menopause and a lack of management training around the menopause and unsympathetic managers. So there's all sorts of risks associated with the menopause, depending on how your operation, where you are, and what your policies set out. So, other ways we can manage. Let's develop awareness, let's run training, let's educate, and actually not just our managers, but our teams as well, because we're all involved in making sure our colleagues feel safe and able to talk about problems and so on. And if we can raise awareness and understanding of the menopause and the associated symptoms, it's highly likely that their impact on work will be minimised, because we are more able to address the issues and then come up with potential solutions. So certainly what we shouldn't be doing is attempting to trivialise someone's experience of the menopause by saying, oh, it's not as bad as it appears, or it was easier for Joe Bloggs who went through the menopause last year, or some such thing. Everybody responds differently to the menopause, so everybody in your organisation needs to be aware of that fact. Some may be relatively unaffected, while others are going to experience significant difficulties for prolonged periods of time. Okay. What else? Follow advice is on here. Absolutely, there's lots of advice available out there. And following the advice of health and safety professionals based on the outcomes of age and gender sensitive risk assessments could be vital. And also occupational health. So if someone is experiencing symptoms, by all means tap into your, if you've got one, an occupational health provider, or write to that person's GP. Obviously there's certain permissions that you need to seek, and you need to do that in the proper way. But there are experts out there that can help you make an informed decision on what you can do to support that person who's going through the menopause. And ultimately, this is all about developing a more inclusive and supportive work culture. And we know that organisations with more inclusive workplace cultures, whether it's menopause or other things, do see an increase in productivity. So actually, this is a win for the organisation, menopause aside, by creating that inclusive and supportive workplace culture. All right. So let's look in a little bit more detail about some of the practical things we can do. Excuse me whilst I slurp on my tea. Okay. So I'm not going to talk through all of these. I might just pick out a couple. And it'll be interesting to hear from anybody else who's listening here if you've either put any of these into place or are thinking about putting them into place, and what impacts they might have had in your organisation. So please do pop in the chat if you put any of these into place. So let's start with mental health, for example. Having a clear mental health policy is hugely helpful, actually not just for people who are experiencing the menopause. And policy is one thing. I'm not just talking about having a piece of paper saying what you intend to do. I'm saying make it a lived policy and make sure people understand it and managers know how to execute it. Okay, so implement and maintain clear mental health policy. What else? Let's go for bathrooms, maybe bathroom requirements. So, I mean, if people are flooding, for example, provide easy access to toilet facilities. It's not difficult. Perhaps you can move their workstation, and that in itself can make them feel more secure. And if needed, maybe allow for them to use toilet facilities that are separate to colleagues, such as a disabled toilet. We're not necessarily applying that label to colleagues, but there's a bit more space. So that could be helpful. We've also got examples actually of menopause packs. So in bathrooms, there are some employers who have put together a little kit, perhaps some extra sanitary towels, perhaps some deodorant, maybe a fan, maybe a chocolate bar, just helping to meeting people's needs that perhaps they weren't expecting to be met or weren't expecting to need. In fact, a little pack in the toilets can go a long way. It's thoughtful. Let's talk about uniform. I've sort of mentioned this a few moments ago. Avoiding nylon uniforms is probably really helpful. More breathable fabrics if people are suffering from hot flushes. And indeed, if you can provide alternative tasks, perhaps where heavy lifting would be the norm, if that person's got joint pain or high levels of fatigue, maybe for certain days of the month or week or whatever, perhaps you can consider alternative tasks. And then there's things like access to natural lights and being able to turn light switches on and off. And if fatigue actually is an issue, it may be reasonable to allow additional rest breaks, or possibly instead of one long lunch break, breaking that into several shorter breaks across the working day, being mindful of the working time regs. If someone's worked 6 hours or more, they are entitled to a 20-minute block. So just being mindful of that. It could be that you make additional allowances for sickness absence. Again, occupational health will be able to tell you what to expect. Maybe you're making adjustments to the working day. Maybe if there's lots of fatigue happening, maybe if it's practical and reasonable in your operation, maybe that person can come in at 10 AM instead of 9, as one example. Or perhaps they start earlier and leave earlier because that works. That helps them manage their symptoms better. And of course, we're all doing a lot more working from home. If that helps, and if that is feasible for your organisation, working from home might support them too. What else? Networking, disclosure, let's talk about that. So in some of the larger organisations that we work with, they are providing opportunities to network with colleagues who are going through similar issues. But of course, there is always the possibility that you'll end up with a network for menopausal people, a network for this, a network for that, a network for the other. But if they're well attended and if they are useful to your team, it can make people feel a real part of a community, which in itself is going to be linking to the commitment to the organisation and retention levels. So that could be really beneficial. Or awareness groups even. What else can we pick out of here? Have we mentioned counselling services yet? No, I don't think we have. Oh, there's EAP, so the Employee Assistance Programme. Many organisations have an EAP, which basically is your phone a friend on anything from health issues and menopause to even financial advice. So some sort of employee assistance programme could be a really easy win, and they don't have to cost the earth. And I guess in all of that, just again remembering that each individual is uniquely affected by the symptoms of the menopause. So it's really important to discuss with them what they actually need. Perhaps using a list of examples, talking through a list of examples with them about what's available. Maybe that's set out in your mental health policy, for example. But it's a really great point to start the discussions with the employee. So your first point, of course, should be meeting with that person, discussing all of the above, and then implementing whichever adjustments or changes need to be implemented as soon as possible, and reviewing to make sure it's helping, make sure it's working, make sure we're doing the right thing. Quite often the starting point for us, and really great practice anyway for any reason that somebody's off work, is to bring them back in with a return to work interview. It's not a formal thing, it can be just a 5-minute chat if all that's needed. But that touching base when somebody comes back into work and they've been off, to say, do you know what, we missed you, here's what happened whilst you were away, is everything all right? Do you need anything? Okay, here's what we need you to do by the end of the week. That sort of touching base really shows as an employer that you value that member of staff, and can go such a long way to uncovering any issues, if there are any, that might need rectifying. So return to work interviews is vital. If you don't do those, we have got one to download on our website actually. It would have been clever of me to give you a lovely QR code. I haven't, I'm afraid, but there is one a bit later on for another tool. So quite often we run this training and then people say to us, well, okay, but if you're telling me people are leaving because they're not confident or effective and because their performance is suffering, how long are we going to be prepared to put up with that? What if, there are genuine performance concerns? And that's a real issue, because I don't think anybody's expecting you to continue to pay somebody who is not performing. So what I'd say to that is, if you've created an open culture and a two-way dialogue, maybe through return to work interviews, maybe through performance reviews, maybe through just day-to-day chatting whilst you're boiling the kettle, if indeed you're all in a workplace, hopefully you've identified the true cause of any performance issues and you've started to put into place steps to support the improved performance. And if it's a shuffle in their working pattern or a different uniform, for example, hopefully that has worked and hopefully the impact has been minimised. But if you can't accommodate further performance problems, then we'll need to essentially go through and follow your capability process, really. So in a supportive and positive manner, because you are mindful that this may well be covered by the Equalities Act if it's deemed to be linked to indirectly age, indirectly sex, for example, although that's more about harassment, and potentially disability. So you really need to make sure that you're taking any health issues fully into account if there is underperformance on the part of the individual. You really need to make sure you've identified any extra support or even coaching that person may benefit from to be able to overcome their problems. And you need to be setting reasonable timescales for those improvements. So if it's as simple as issuing a new uniform, meaning she won't need to go and have a shower every 20 minutes, your time frame for improvement should be a few days max, right? If actually it's all about confidence and maybe you're getting in a coach to have 3 or 4 sessions with that individual, it's not likely you're going to see an improvement in 3 to 4 days. It might take a couple of months for the coach to have got underneath the skin of what's going on, and they will have worked together on strategies to increase confidence and then been put into place. So the timescales will be longer. Okay. So if you've been through a couple of rounds of informal performance management, maybe, and you've documented a couple of performance improvement plans with those timescales and adjustments, if improvements are still not forthcoming, and if it's not reasonable to accommodate further the underperformance, then sometimes, well, then you potentially are looking at pursuing your formal capability process. So that's a sequence of warnings, sort of 3 strikes, and on the third one, essentially, it would be a dismissal. What I would say with that is that sometimes with situations like this, when you've exhausted all other options, it can be more beneficial, possibly kinder, dare I say, to consider a settlement agreement over those sequence of warnings and dismissal on grounds of capability. And a settlement agreement, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a legally binding document where you agree to pay a sum of money in return for essentially agreeing the exit of that person. A reference potentially, if that's what's part of the deal, and that person will essentially, you'll shake hands, you won't have damaged their confidence further, and you are also out of that getting protection from legal protection from any claims of discrimination, because essentially for paying them, you're paying them that money to sign away their rights. But again, both part company with dignity, and there's some protection there. So it's worth considering that as an outcome. I haven't had any questions yet. Any questions so far? Hopefully I haven't blinded everybody with science.
Can't see any in the inbox. Carl, can you see any that's come through just yet?
No, there's no questions currently asked by anyone, and there's no hands up either.
Okie dokie.
So,
well, let's
feel
move
free
on.
to drop questions in. Feel free to put your hands up, guys. Thank you.
I will move on then to some really great resources that are out there and really accessible. So what do we know? We know that those going through the menopause or the perimenopause are the fastest growing demographic in the workplace, and that a significant proportion of those struggle to manage those changes that their bodies are going through. And we know that 1/4 of people experience debilitating symptoms which lead them to exit the workplace completely at the top of their career, probably, and this is a massive loss of talent, as we've said. And that's why these resources are so great, and I'm referring you to them. So Women's Health Concern, fantastic resource Lots of information there you can tap into, so please have a look at that. ACAS, again, so this is a government funded organisation, some great resources there. British Menopause Society, and I was going to say surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, there are a number of Facebook groups that have sprung up, and that's where I got some of those quotes from that we looked at earlier on. So things like the Perimenopause Hub, Latte Lounge, there are lots of communities of people offering support and advice. So from those resources, you might, as an employer, you might want to look at some of those. You might want to signpost your team to look at some of those, depending on their actual need. I seem to have raced through here. This is my QR code for those that would find it useful. We do have a menopause at work checklist on our website. It's a free download. Yes, it will capture your details, but you can absolutely opt out if that's what you choose to do. We've developed a checklist that managers can work through to understand the impacts of menopause on an individual and discuss ways forward to offer the support that's needed. So do have a look at that. I won't move on too quickly, but I am coming to the end of my information. I have rattled through and we haven't had any questions.